right, so let's start. It's 4:01. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Applied Development Economics Seminar Series. We are very excited to have you all here and hope everyone is well and safe in these uncertain times. For the last 2 years in September, the Lahore School of Economics has hosted the Applied Development Economics Conference with the aim of highlighting recent research and to give academics in the field of development economics an opportunity to receive feedback on their work and to network with other colleagues. The conference this year was cancelled for obvious reasons. Luckily, our world seems to have quickly adapted to technology and staying indoors and having all our meetings virtually. So we now have more access to an international audience and network of academics and policymakers than ever before. And so we're taking advantage of this development and our collaboration with IGC and CDPR. The ADE Seminar series will keep the spirit of the ADE conference alive via weekly seminars every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time. We highly encourage early career researchers to participate not only by attending these seminars, but also by sending in their work that they would like to be presented at the ADE. I'll now invite Dr. Navid Hamid, Director CREB, to say a few words before we begin.
Well, thank you, Farah. And actually, I think it's Farah, Hamna, and the rest of the ADE team show. I just want to, on behalf of the rector of the Lahore School of Economics, Dr. Shahid Ahmed Chaudhry, who could not be here because he's on a call, the Faculty of Economics, and the Center for Research in Economic Business, would like to welcome all of you, and particularly Dr. ImranRasul, who is a regular participant at our conference, and really we appreciate his participation here in the inaugural session of the ADE Seminar series. I just want to say these words of welcome, and I'm very happy to see so many people here. And unless Azam wants to say a few words, I'll hand back to Farah.
No, I just wanted to invite Imran also. I think I'm glad to see so many of our colleagues have joined us and everyone is safe. And I wanted to especially thank Imran. Imran represents a lot of what we believe in terms of strong beliefs in economic equality and everything we believe in terms of development. Imran really exemplifies that. So it's really a pleasure to have Imran back at the Lahore School, even if it's virtually. And I'll pass it on to Imran. Thanks, Imran, for joining us.
Thank you everybody for inviting me.
Yeah. Let me just introduce, although you need no introduction, but for those of us joining us, let me just very quickly introduce Dr. ImranRasul. He is Professor of Economics at the University College London. He's also co-director of the Center for Microeconomic Analysis of Public Policy at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Research Program Director of the firm's portfolio at the International Growth Center. He's a managing editor of the Journal of European Economic Association, a fellow of the British Academy, and a council representative on the Royal Economic Society Executive Committee. In 2019, he and Dr. Oriana Bandiera were jointly awarded the highly prestigious Eero Janssen Award in Economics for significant contributions in theoretical and applied research in economics in Europe. His research lies at the intersection of labor, development, and public economics, and we are very fortunate to have him today to share insights from his work on policies for human capital accumulation amongst the world's poor. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules for people who are joining us today. Dr. Rasul will have about 40 minutes for his presentation. During this time, we encourage participants to post any questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. We will then have 15 minutes Q&A at the session at the end. In addition to the questions sent in earlier during this time, you can use the raise hand function to indicate you have a question. You may be asked to unmute and ask your question live. We will try to get to as many questions as we can, and so we request that you keep your questions brief and to the point. And with that, I want to hand over to Dr. ImranRasul. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for Navid. Azam, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to just share my screen, so you should be able to see my presentation. Can you see that fine? Great. So yeah, like I was saying, it's a pleasure to be here. It's just very disappointing not to be there in person, and I hope very soon we will all be out of this and I'll be able to visit again and interact with everybody personally. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present sort of an overview of some of the work I've been doing in the last decade, and just to give a roadmap, I think, of some outstanding questions in this area related to human capital accumulation of the world's poor. And so this is what I'm going to present is a sort of a series of findings from 4 different papers, which are at various stages, some of which are published, some of which are in progress. And these are all co-authored with a large number of individuals. But I think they highlight different aspects of sort of the key strands of what I want to get across in this agenda, which really relates to the measurement of human capital, what we think about the process of accumulating human capital, and the misallocation of human capital across tasks. So on the measurement of human capital, sort of a very traditional way of thinking about this characteristic is in terms of anthropometric outcomes or health outcomes. So we typically have surveys where we try to measure birth weight, height for age, weight for age, and so on and so forth. It's been well known and long known that those types of measures combine both stock and flow elements. So a more recent literature has focused on skills in particular, and their economists tend to make a distinction between cognitive versus non-cognitive skills or character traits. And by those non-cognitive skills, I mean personality traits or other types of specific traits such as grit or patience. There's been a movement in some of the literature to think about sort of developmental skills in terms of motor skills or ability to communicate, as well as an extension of those types of non-cognitive skills, especially early in life. What I wanted to emphasize at the outset is that there's many possible ways that we could set up a typology of those skills or traits. And there's no correct way to do this, but I just wanted to put it out there for researchers working in this area of how we might think of the best way to define skills and traits. And so one way to do that might be by the sphere of economic activity that we're studying. So in traditional markets, such as educational labor markets, that's where our division of cognitive and non-cognitive skills that we're most used to thinking about may be well applicable. But then there are other spheres of economic activity, such as when we're thinking about the quality of decision-making, where particular traits such as rationality, patience, risk preferences may play an important role. There may be other spheres of economic activity which involve social interactions, where traits related to personality, competitiveness, the degree to which you're concerned about social image may play a first-order role. And there may be other aspects of economic behavior, and that might be particularly relevant when thinking about the process of economic development, which is regards to how individuals cope with volatile or uncertain environments, their ability to negotiate, hot and cold decision-making, and the role of emotions. Those might be particularly important when we're thinking about that sphere of economic activity. So that's just an alternative typology by which to set out what we mean by this broad range of skills that may be relevant for economic outcomes. And of course, I think there's growing interest in the role that mental health plays in all of this, and how we might model that, and what types of decisions we might think of as being particularly important to understand sort of the skills or mental health status of an individual. I think the bigger picture for development is that in the long run, we might think of the process of economic development as being described by changing relative returns to brawn, so traditional measures of anthropometrics or health or people's physical capability, versus the returns to what we might regard as brains, the returns to particular skills or particular traits. As we go through the process of economic development, one way to characterize that is the relative returns to these two broad classes of skill change over time. But another way to classify the process of development is the gradual transition from informal institutions and the interaction or replacement with more formal institutions. And there, as an economy develops, we tend to have this long-run characterization that we have market-driven anonymity in economic exchange. And when the nature of interactions that people are making goes through that transformation, the types of skills we might want to measure and value may well be changing as part of that process. So that there's lots of different issues there, just sort of underlying the agenda I'm now going to describe in terms of just how we might want to measure human capital, what might be the relevant traits for any particular sphere of economic activity. So let me move on to describe the accumulation of human capital. And so human capital is accumulated through the life cycle. So large and expanding literature studying early childhood development, where we might think of human capital as being developed even before birth, that an individual can be undergoing that process while they're in utero. And part of the motivation for that comes from the fact that when we look at birth weights and heights around the world, many children in low-income settings seem to be born stunted even at birth. And so that process of under-accumulation of human capital starts even while a child is in utero. That tells us that we might want to time interventions very, very early in life, even while a child is in utero. Then there are other stages of human capital accumulation that are equally important: preschool, formal schooling, understanding the forces that drive the successful transition of individuals from the formal education system into the labor market. And then once into the labor market, people can continue to acquire human capital. And that might be increasingly important in the given sort of changes in technology and the need for people to reallocate themselves across sectors over time, more generally, and perhaps specifically in relation to the current crisis. It may be very important for individuals to be able to reskill and move across sectors, some of which are declining, towards those that we think are going to be relatively more prosperous in future. So there may be important roles to understand what are the drivers of the returns to vocational training or on-the-job training as provided by firms. In all of these different processes, there's a body of evidence in economics and other disciplines that suggests that initial conditions matter, that getting things right very early in life will have large and persistent impacts over an individual's life cycle. In addition, we know there are dynamic complementarities across these different stages of the life cycle, so that investing in human capital at one particular stage will tend to have positive spillover effects on other stages of human capital acquisition. So in that sense, it's a little bit false to think of one of these stages in complete isolation from another stage. There will be those intertemporal complementarities in human capital accumulation. But what makes the process complex is that the actors, the objectives, and the constraints that drive human capital accumulation would differ across these stages. And in a number of the examples that I'll set out, I'll talk about some of these different stages that I've studied and what I see as being the great challenges for research going forward in understanding the accumulation of human capital at these different stages and their interlinkage. So as I said, the earlier stage is one of early childhood development. And so there's a body of evidence now to suggest that interventions to boost human capital accumulation early in life have private, social, and intergenerational returns. And there's a growing and well-established body of evidence to suggest that the potential internal rates of return to such interventions are really first order and hard to match for most other development policies. So this has got a lot of attention, both amongst academics and amongst policymakers, to try to understand. I've been doing some recent work in the context of northern Nigeria, studying, using a large-scale long-term randomized control trial, what is the impact of providing both mothers and fathers information and high-valued and long-lasting unconditional cash transfers on children's outcomes in that context. And this is a context in which 50% of households are ultra-poor, 15% of households are food insecure in the sense that in some parts of the year, the supply of food falls dramatically. Households typically have to then resort to very extreme coping strategies to get through those lean seasons. And pre-intervention, this is the context in which both mothers and fathers have very low levels of knowledge about early childhood practices. So for example, 13% of both mothers and fathers know that they should exclusively breastfeed a child for the first 6 months. 87% of them would not exclusively breastfeed a child for the first 6 months. What would be the next best alternative to that? It would be to give the child water. But typically water in this area is highly contaminated, and that leads to very, very low levels of human capital accumulation and very high levels of early childhood mortality. So infant mortality rates in this area are about 9 or 10%, that in turn drives very high levels of fertility. So you might think of this context as being one in which outcomes, initial conditions are very poor here. This is almost the worst place that you might imagine such a policy being able to be implemented, but it might have potentially large returns given the very sort of low underlying initial conditions here. So the intervention that we studied provides information both to mothers and fathers. It provides information both about the antenatal stage of pregnancy, so encouraging mothers to eat more during pregnancy, to attend antenatal care. Perinatal practices as well as postnatal messages are provided in terms of encouraging parents to exclusively breastfeed children once they're born, and to give them some advice about how to start weaning them once they switch from breastfeeding to eating food. And that information is provided almost as a public good within a village, both to mothers and fathers. That information is coupled with a cash transfer that then is targeted towards mothers to try to relax resource constraints that might also be leading to some of these very low outcomes for children pre-intervention. The cash transfers that are provided are very high valued. They're valued at about $22 per month at the time. So no matter how you benchmark these correspond to a big cash injection for these households. They correspond to about 80% of female earnings pre-intervention, or about 25% of household consumption. And what's interesting is that the transfers are provided over a long period of time. They're provided from the moment the pregnancy is verified. So using a urine sample, they're provided each month up until the child turns 24 months old. So that's almost like a temporary basic income for these mothers, and offers them a far more stable and substantial flow of resources than are going to be typically available to these mothers through standard income generating activities in these rural economies. As I said, you become eligible for the program as soon as you're verified to be pregnant, and that's conducted through a urine sample. There's no means test beyond that. Anybody, irrespective of the baseline wealth, will be eligible for the program as long as they're pregnant. We evaluate this using a randomized controlled trial where we track about 3,600 mothers at baseline, 2 years later at midline, and 4 years later at endline. So this is going to be a long-term evaluation where we're going to track the outcomes of their mothers, as well as the child who was born, who was in utero at baseline, over those first 4 years of life, to see, are there beneficial effects on these children's outcomes? And more importantly, are they persistent, or do we see some fade out of these outcomes over time? And the sample that I'll focus on in particular are a set of mothers who were already pregnant at baseline. So these mothers, when the program starts, are immediately eligible for the program. So that's putting to one side any concerns about mothers endogenously choosing to become pregnant in order to receive these high-valued and long-lasting cash transfers. We actually have some more recent work from this context using another sample of 1,700 women who were purposefully chosen to study those questions of endogenous selection into the program. So that's a set of mothers who were not pregnant at the time the program started. And there we try to understand to what extent is there intertemporal changes in the timing of births in response to the program. But the results I present now are based on these mothers who were pregnant at baseline and so didn't choose to become eligible for the program. And what we find is this big program, I mean, it's a fairly substantial cost of this program, both in terms of the cash transfers, the delivery of those transfers, setting up the information channels. But this kind of big push intervention does have large and long-lasting outcomes for children. So, for example, it reduces stunting rates by about 8% at midline, and those persist till endline. So there are 7% reductions in stunting rates 4 years after the program starts amongst those children who are in utero at baseline. At the tail of the distribution, it also reduces extreme stunting. So for those children who are more than 3 standard deviations below international norms, given their age and gender, we see about a 14% reduction in extreme stunting. And again, that effect persists 4 years later. We see big improvements in their health, so big reductions in the incidence of diarrhea, big increase in take-up of deworming medications, and an enormous increase in the percentage of children receiving complete vaccinations across the board. And we know that some of those outcomes themselves, in terms of a child being dewormed or being vaccinated, we know that there are long-term benefits of the children of just those outcomes in and of themselves. But we're finding anthropometric impacts over and above that. We're finding big improvements in their physical health in terms of reduced stunting and reduced extreme stunting. And these results are very encouraging. They're not just large, they're also very persistent, which hasn't been documented very much in developing country context. Most evaluations have found results that tend to fade out slightly over time or don't follow children for such a long period of time. In contrast to those, we're finding that a very large injection of both information and cash does have potentially very large impacts on those children's outcomes. We also document that those outcomes then spill over onto their older siblings and their younger siblings as well in terms of improved health outcomes for their siblings as well. And so what's driving this? We have a combined intervention that provides mothers and fathers both information as well as providing cash. And so we try to disentangle the relative importance of those two elements of the program to really understand what might be the best way to design these programs. And we find that both elements are important, but at slightly different moments in the child's life. So in the first 2 years of life, we find the returns to providing information are really first order. Most of the impact on children's anthropometric outcomes are given because parents are more knowledgeable. They treat the child in a different way. Their practices related to child rearing change. And that's what's really driving some of the anthropometric outcomes that we see in the first 2 years of life. However, what becomes key for sustaining those outcomes between years 2 and years 4 are the cash injection that's provided. Information becomes relatively less important over time. Resources become relatively more important for sustaining those outcomes over time. And the reason for that is down to what the cash is being used for. The cash transfers are provided directly to women in the household. A lot of those get spent on consumption, food consumption that is driving some of the outcomes I was showing before. But a lot of that actually gets channeled into improving the labor market activities of women. We see an increased incidence of women engaging in labor market activities, and especially an expansion of women into their self-employment activities. One key form of self-employment for women in this context is rearing livestock and selling livestock products. And so a key use of the cash transfer is in order to purchase more livestock and then improve earnings as a result. And so what we see is that essentially by providing unconditional cash transfers, in the long run, women are able to use those in this context to change and invest in their labor market activities, in productive investment opportunities, and that endogenously raises their own earnings in the long run by an amount that's almost equivalent to the additional cash transfer that's provided. So for every dollar that's provided as an unconditional cash transfer, that almost generates a one-for-one increase in endogenous earnings through these various channels. And by investing in livestock, that's a particular type of asset that doesn't just generate a mean flow of earnings, it also reduces the volatility of earnings over the course of the year, but it also produces a flow of nutrition that then feeds back into the children, which we then document as part of the reason why children's outcomes also improve in the longer term through the consumption of protein-rich foods such as milk and a particular stage of their life cycle. Overall, under plausible scenarios, we find the internal rate of the return to the program to be between 10 and 20%. The program essentially is highly cost effective. And so this is the case even in very deprived populations to begin with, even in locations with very low state capacity, we find that these types of early childhood intervention can be very cost effective. And so there's lots of promise here to try to expand these further into other very low income contexts. There's a number of unanswered questions that really set out an agenda in and of themselves. So one key question is, what is the role of universal eligibility? And so the reason why I'm raising this is that one of the nicest things about the study is that what I've presented to you so far, the quantitative results from the randomized controlled trial evaluation. This was all conducted in parallel with a qualitative study that was led by a team of anthropologists and nutritionists who were also sampling from our same sample, but going into much more in depth into asking households what some of the mechanisms were, what they were doing with the cash. And that all largely corroborates what we've shown quantitatively. But one element that comes from those qualitative interviews is that the role of universality turns out to be somewhat key, that when low wealth women see higher wealth women changing their practices, those kinds of peer effects have very large multiplier effects in these contexts. So it's claimed in the qualitative work. So it's important in that sense for targeting to be very broad. And if there are social norms that are driving some of these practices to begin with, the qualitative work suggests that trying to break those norms by having universal eligibility might be self-enforcing and reinforcing some of the positive outcomes we're seeing. As I mentioned before, there's an interesting set of questions to ask about extensive margin fertility responses to the program, to say that, you know, we're offering a large amount of unconditional cash to mothers as soon as they can verify themselves to be pregnant. Doesn't that lead to potential unintended consequences of individuals speeding up the timing of births in order to get access to those cash transfers? So what exactly happens to those households who are not pregnant at baseline? Do they respond to the offer of cash transfers? And that could have very detrimental effects on children if you speed up births and reduce birth spacings. And so I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. We have some very recent work on trying to understand whether and how households respond on that margin. Third open question is, you know, we tried to target fathers here in terms of the information that was provided. We didn't try to exclude them. Was that cost effective to try to involve fathers? What is the exact role of fathers here in determining how women can act on this type of information? And I think the last question is something I'll come back to on my final slide, is in terms of the general equilibrium effects of the program. As I mentioned before, there are very high rates of fertility in this context, partly driven by very high rates of child mortality. So at baseline, we observe, you know, about 40–45% of women who are sampled are pregnant in the cross-section at baseline. So over the course of a 4-year evaluation, almost every woman in this village of ages between 15 and 45 becomes pregnant at least once. And so what the program is doing is essentially, by changing practices, it's changing the demand that people put onto healthcare. They're demanding different services now from antenatal clinics as they become more informed. They're demanding changes in the quality of other forms of infrastructure that they now have. Do we actually see any impact of this type of RCT generating a large shocks to localized demand in terms of how the supply of healthcare then responds? And if the supply of healthcare improves as a result, you can imagine that would have many more beneficial effects beyond just practices related to early childhood. Now let me move on to the allocation of human capital. And so here we can think about two distinct processes. In urban labor markets, we might think that it's important to understand search frictions and how workers and firms are matching. And there's a body of work I've been doing related to that I'll describe in a second. In rural labor markets, I think that the classic way to think about those labor markets is in terms of a very dual economy as set out by Arthur Lewis in the 1950s. So we might think of the very poorest households are essentially engaged in insecure wage labor, where they're just using their labor in order to produce output. And the key stepping stone that we want to get them to engage in and to understand what constrains them not doing this is to be able to start combining their labor with capital. So it's essentially moving away from insecure wage labor to various forms of self-employment or transformative entrepreneurship, where individuals are working with capital as well as their own labor. And how do households make that transformation from one type of occupation to another type of occupation? And then the third strand of this broad literature in terms of the allocation of human capital is thinking about the interlinkages between urban and rural labour markets in terms of the process of migration from one to the other. And there's some very interesting recent work that goes back a long way to Roy's original model of thinking about why doesn't everybody just move to urban labour markets? Is that a matter of self-selection? Is that a matter of comparative advantage? And really trying to disentangle those two motives for migration across different labour markets. So in terms of urban labour markets, one key feature we observe around the world is that youth unemployment or underemployment is a key policy challenge in most low-income contexts. In fact, I think it's true to say that in just about every country on the planet, youth unemployment rates are at least as high as adult unemployment rates. And economists have been thinking about this problem for a long time and trying to understand why is that the case and what can be done to reduce youth unemployment. And so there's a class of explanations very much focused on pre-labour market factors that say that when young workers enter the labour market, they lack the relevant skills or they lack the relevant information in order to gain jobs. And that might in part be a fault of the formal education system not providing the types of skills that firms actually value. Another class of explanation is very much focused on the firm side of the labour market. So say workers may face various barriers to being hired. So that may be because firms lack the resources to find workers, to appropriately screen those workers once they found them, or to train them even once they found them. So the constraints really lie on the firm side rather than on the worker side. And so what I'll describe is an intervention and a study that really tries to understand both sets of constraints in the same context. And that fits into a broader sort of agenda that we have, which is to try to understand this search and matching process of how do workers go around the economy to find these good jobs, and how do firms actually go about the process of finding workers. And that's going to be very important because that's going to drive a transition from low-skill itinerant jobs to allowing, if we can improve that search process and allow workers to move into higher skill or more productive jobs, improve the allocation of talent, that will in turn drive fiscal capacity and be part of the process of structural change that we might think in and of itself drives the process of development. So the second policy intervention that I wanted to go through was a 6-year randomized control trial we've been conducting in Uganda. And what's innovative here is this is a 2-sided randomized control trial that involves both workers and firms. So on the worker side, we've been tracking over this time period a series of very young labour market entrants who are just trying to find their first jobs. They're just making that initial transition into the labour market. On the firm side, we've been tracking a set of small and medium-sized enterprises who are operating across 17 different markets in 8 sectors, covering both manufacturing and service sectors in Uganda. These are very important sectors for the Ugandan economy as a whole. About 1 in 4 individuals who are aged below 30 are employed in one of these 8 sectors. And so this is a 2-sided experimental design where we have both treated and control workers and treated and control firms, and we're matching the two together. And so the randomized control trial is designed to measure the causal impacts both on workers and on firms of having the following 2 forms of experimental variation. A subset of workers will be experimentally offered the provision of vocational training. And that training will be undertaken for 6 months at a vocational training institute. And so they will acquire a different set of skills before they enter the labour market and start matching with firms. So that's very much trying to understand what are sort of worker side or pre-labour market constraints to driving worker outcomes. They'll be trained for 6 months in a sector-specific skill in one of the 8 sectors that we're tracking on the firm side. The other intervention will be essentially to incentivize firms to hire and train workers on the job through a very classic apprenticeship structure. So we'll essentially be offering firms operating in one of these 8 sectors a wage subsidy to take on a worker who was willing to apply for the vocational training but was randomized out of the vocational training. But then the firm will decide to take on that worker through this wage subsidy and to train them as they would normally do in-house using this apprenticeship program. And we're going to study this in the context of Uganda, which is an economy which has a very skewed age distribution. The vast majority of individuals are young in that economy. And so youth employment remains a key policy issue in Uganda, as it does in much of East Africa, much of South Asia. But the key distinction between the types of skills that are acquired through vocational training and firm-provided training is not just the balance between general and firm-specific skills that are being provided to workers, but the key difference is also going to be that vocational training provides skills to workers that are certifiable. That when you leave the Vocational Training Institute, you leave with a piece of paper that demonstrates that you've achieved certain skills training that then you can show to other employers, and that may have impacts on your labor market mobility, in particular your ability to move into employment over time, which is not possible for workers who've been trained in an apprenticeship structure, where that type of certification isn't typically provided in this context. And so what do we find? Well, the results are summarized in the figure on the right-hand side. So on the x-axis, we have the time periods, and on the y-axis, we just have a summary measure of employment rates quarter by quarter for 3 groups of workers. Those who are in the control group in the blue line, those who have received firm-provided training in the green line, and those who have received vocational training in the red line. Okay. So we see for all 3 groups of workers, employment rates are rising over time. These workers are just transitioning into the labor market. Things are naturally improving for them at the rate that's shown in the control group. If you then compare the control group to the apprentices who were randomly assigned to the firm-provided training, we see that with the offer of the wage subsidy in the very early time periods, the firm-provided training workers have higher employment rates over time, initially, but over time they converge back to the control group. The vocational trainees start off very close to the control group, but over time they're diverging away from both the control group and the firm-provided trainees. Okay, and what's happening there is that these differences are really driven by the dynamics. In steady state, the earnings of vocationally trained workers rise by about 34% over those of the control group, whereas the earnings of firm-trained workers rise, but it's a smaller increase, and that increase is about 24%. The mechanism that's driving that divergence is purely dynamic. By following these workers over a long period of time, we see them falling into unemployment, so falling off the job ladder. We see them getting back onto the job ladder, and we also see them sometimes making job-to-job transitions. The key dynamic that's different between vocationally trained workers and firm-trained workers is the rate at which they make unemployment to employment transitions. So for workers who've been vocationally trained that have this certificate, if they happen to become unemployed, they find jobs much more quickly than workers who've been firm trained who don't have this certification. This is despite the fact that both groups of workers having very similar sets of measurable skills initially. But essentially, when firm trained workers fall off the job ladder, from there on, they behave as if they're control group workers. Their labor market history is essentially wiped out as soon as they fall off the job ladder and fall into a state of unemployment. Their previous experience, because it cannot be verified, doesn't count for their future prospects. And so over time, as apprentices lose jobs, they gradually converge to what was happening to the control group overall. Okay. Whereas vocational trainees, if they do fall off the job ladder, they rapidly and much more quickly get back onto the job ladder in terms of making those unemployment to job transitions. And so that means their employment spells are both longer, their unemployment spells are shorter, and their unemployment to job transitions are much more frequent. All of those factors combine to give them higher steady state earnings. So the key difference between these forms of training is not in terms of the human capital that the workers acquire, but it's in terms of the signals that they can send to potential employers that allows them to get back onto the job ladder more quickly. Both of them are better than doing nothing. Both of them have positive internal rates of return. To the apprenticeships, we find an internal rate of return of around about 10%. But to vocational trainees, the internal rates of return are much higher. They're around about 20%. So at the top end of the IIR that we found for the early childhood intervention that I showed you before. And the key mechanism there is one of dynamics. Let me skip over this. Let me just talk a little bit about rural labour markets as well, because we've done a lot of work with regards to trying to understand how do we get the ultra poor in various economies. We're now working on this in Pakistan. We have some historic work looking at this in Bangladesh, so I'll talk about now, of how we get the ultra poor in very rural labour markets to transition from using just their own labour and engage in insecure wage labour to combining that with some form of capital. Okay, and we can really think about the attempts to make this transformation process as being the history of development policy. So anti-poverty programs often fall into two strands: those that focus on the labor component or the human capital component, those that focus on the capital component. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this capital component in the context of an asset transfer program that tries to offer the ultra poor the possibility to combine their labor with capital, and sees, one, whether they're interested in doing so, and two, amongst those that take up, do we find positive returns from doing so? Can they make success of this capital injection? And so we do that in the context of the Ultra Poor program that was initiated by BRAC. And this is, again, a large-scale, long-term randomized control trial we've been running with BRAC throughout rural Bangladesh. And so the potential beneficiaries from these programs are the poorest women in the poorest villages in rural Bangladesh. So these ultra-poor women, the vast majority of whom are illiterate, own no productive assets at baseline, and reside on less than $1 a day. And the program essentially...
We have 5 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. The program targets them by offering them a menu of different assets. So think of this as a potential combination of different Ks that they can then combine with their own L. And that includes a bundle of livestock that's offered to these ultra-poor women. And the vast majority of women choose a livestock combination. And so we're providing them that capital injection, and we combine that with providing them with livestock-specific training that lasts 2 years to train them how to use these animals. Because a key characteristic of ultra-poor women in this context is that they've never owned livestock, their families never owned livestock. This is a new activity for them altogether. Prior to the intervention, they were purely engaged in insecure wage labor, working in agriculture or working as maids in other people's households. So this is a very transformative type of self-employment that we're offering them. We want to know whether they're able to make a success of it. Okay. So in the evaluation, we track 20,000 households across 1,400 villages. We've been tracking them for now 11 years. And so what I'll show you are the impacts 2 years out, 4 years out. They're sustained at 7 and 11 years out. But in the original paper that we wrote, it was looking at those 4-year impacts. And this is a partial population experiment. So in the paper, we describe both what happens to those ultra-poor women who are eligible for the program, as well as what happens to the distribution of outcomes in the rest of the village economy as women engage in these activities. But the history of the paper can be described in the following way. At baseline, this is the characterization of what ultra-poor women were doing. About a quarter of them were engaged only in insecure wage labor. About 20% of them were completely out of the labor force. They had no source of labor activity or labor earnings. They were completely reliant on transfers from other individuals. About 30% of them were engaged in some form of self-employment, typically using just very, very small scale assets. And about another quarter were engaged in both wage labor as well as these very basic forms of self-employment. So this is very much like a textbook form of poor. They're engaged in multiple activities. They're doing both wage labor and self-employment. Often these are very irregular, exposing them to a lot of earning seasonality, and many of them are just unemployed all. What happens as we provide them the asset transfer stock? Well, 2 years later, there's a complete transformation of their occupational choices. Just about all of them reallocate out of exclusive reliance on wage labor, out of unemployment, into either just exclusively specializing in wage employment or still holding on to some forms of wage labor in addition to self-employment. and that's sustained 4 years later. And so in the paper, we document huge permanent changes in the allocation of labor of these households over time that then persist over time, that then reinforce asset accumulation in these households and allow them 4 years out, 7 years out to permanently escape poverty over time. What happens to the control group? Nothing. That's the natural process of structural change that's taking place in rural Bangladesh over the time. There's very little changes in labor allocations that would naturally occur absent the program. Again, calculating the internal rate of return to the program, we find that that corresponds to about 14%. So again, this is a very worthwhile investment for the social planner or for policymakers to consider. The impacts are large, persistent, there are positive spillovers to the rest of the village economy, and these results have been replicated across a variety of studies. In the time that I have left, let me just come full circle to show you what happened to the children of these women and link back to the very first example I showed you in terms of interventions that can raise outcomes early in life. We've recently completed an 11-year follow-up of households that I've just been describing were treated with the Ultra-Poor program in 2007. Okay, so we've now been able to track those households and measure a range of outcomes for their children of ultra-poor women 11 years later. And what's interesting is that, eligible women at the time of treatment had children who were very young. Some of them would have been in utero, some of them would have been age 0 to 5, some of them would have been slightly older. For all of these children, we can see their outcomes up to 11 years later. And so what we're going to try to understand is, well, how does the program, by changing the resources that households have, how does it impact some of the outcomes early in life that we're interested in? And how does it impact schooling choices and ultimately the intergenerational impacts on labor market choices for the children of those women who were treated? And so we have some early results, just bringing the whole analysis full circle. Let me just run through those. So when we first focus on those children who were aged 0 to 5 at the time the asset was transferred to their mother, we see that in the longer term, 11 years after that treatment took place, we see significantly lower rates of stunting, lower rates of malnourishment, and lower rates of underweight. Okay, so we see permanent impacts in terms of some of those anthropometric outcomes that I showed you for children in the very first study, but we're seeing persistent impacts on these children who happen to be born up to 5 years before the intervention started. We're age 0 to 5 at the intervention. If you're older, if you're age 6 to 11 at the time the intervention started, we don't see such dramatic impacts on those anthropometrics. So you have to be sufficiently young. At the time the household receives this capital injection, the mother receives a big improvement in her earning status in order for these anthropometric outcomes to be borne out. But we can also look at schooling outcomes. So when we look at schooling outcomes, we see big improvements for boys. School completion rates increase for boys for both primary and secondary. So we see for those children who were slightly older at the time the program started, they're much more likely to fully complete these various important stages of schooling in Bangladesh. And perhaps the most exciting results are in terms of the occupational choices of boys as a result. And so this just shows you across a range of occupations, we see the boys' occupational choices changing in a similar way as their mothers, that they're much less likely to engage in casual work. They become much more likely to either themselves become a farmer, engage in animal husbandry, engage in other skilled work, or potentially other businesses. So what we're starting to see is that some of the impacts of the program last across a generation, both in terms of improved human capital of those who were just born at the time of the intervention, improved schooling of those who were slightly older, and improved occupational choices of those who we now can see 11 years later making their own first transition into the labour market. So the internal rate of return that I described before of 14% is very much an underestimate because we completely ignore these intergenerational impacts. This is essentially breaking the cycle of poverty of the lowest income households in these contexts. And I think that has huge implications for how we think of social mobility, the whole process of development in these village economies. But it comes with a large scale cash or transfer of resources to these households at baseline, but the impacts can exist within and across generations. So that's really sets out a future agenda, I think, that I'd encourage everybody, especially the younger members of the audience, to think about working on these aspects. There are important elements of both the measurement of human capital, understanding how does it accumulate, and what do people then do with their human capital? How optimally is it assigned? How wrong is the misallocation of talent in the economy, and what might be driving some of those frictions? I think more specifically, what I'm really trying to understand in ongoing work, and this is based in Pakistan, is like, where does the demand for good policy come from? Do individuals recognize these potential benefits to them when they are the beneficiaries of these programs? And what are the impacts of these kinds of asset transfer programs on the poor as well as the non-poor within these villages in terms of their life satisfaction? Does it change individuals' preferences for redistribution? Does it change perceptions of inequality? Do these types of policies change trust in state or civic capital? What are some of the broader non-economic impacts of these interventions? And then finally, just to return to something I mentioned before, one of the criticisms that randomized control trials often receive is that they don't really tell us much about the pro-structural transformation and what's taken millions, if not hundreds of millions of individuals out of poverty over the last few decades. And I think that's a little bit of an unfair criticism. Here we're seeing evidence in this work and in other work of large persistent transformations that are kickstarting across generations of these type that can be evaluated. But I think more importantly, what the gap that we're trying to fill in is what is the link between demand and supply here. So if we go back to the first study in the context of Nigeria, if we're thinking about an information intervention, you're really changing the demand for services there. And so what we'd really like to do in our next generation of evaluations is link that to see whether supply side actors then respond as you change the demand for government services or the demand for other types of services from the public through randomized control trials. We have evidence of that in terms of people voting with their feet in both education and health markets. And I think that's a nice interlinkage between what a micro study can tell you and what might be some of the macro implications. So I think that's also a very fruitful area of research going forward. Okay, let me conclude there and thank everybody for attending and listening, and I'm happy to open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Imran. This was a fantastic summary of some very important work that you've done. I'm amazed you managed to combine this in a 40-minute presentation. We have a number of questions. Some of the people have asked that they not be unmuted because of background noise. So I'm going to ask a few questions myself, and for the rest, I'll ask for them to unmute. So Tarina Musaddiq is asking, are the effects on child health in the long run different for first births? And do the effects vary by the education of parents? This is related to your first set of studies, I think.
Yeah, so okay, so in the first, we have very little variation in the human capital of parents, all uniformly low levels of human capital. These are all rural economies in northern Nigeria. And so there's no meaningful distinction between highly educated and low educated households. They're all equally sort of low levels of human capital, however you mention them. And in addition, because fertility rates are high, most households on average at baseline have 4 children already. But when we split the results between those early in their life fertility cycle and those late in the fertility cycle, we don't find any evidence of heterogeneous responses or heterogeneous differentials of the program. It's a very uniform impact on child outcome, irrespective of the birth order of the child.
Okay, next up is Sonia Balhotra. Sonia, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. If that's not possible, then let me know.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Sonia. Yep.
Hi, Imran. Thank you. That's a tour de force and very clear. I just have 2 very quick questions on your Nigeria paper. The first is this a setting where men don't seek to appropriate the cash transfer given to women? Because it's a lot of money. And I ask because that seems often a threat to this sort of intervention.
Sure. Okay, so that is purely the focus of our most recent work, to try to look at households for whom women were not pregnant at baseline, and then see how do they change the timing of their fertility in response to the program. And the concern there is that, you know, these households are residing in poverty, they're food insecure, they're credit constrained, they have a very volatile economic environment. All of these incentives say you should move forward the timing of fertility in order to access these resources. You don't need to change the timing of fertility to get the information. That's a public good. It's all a matter of who controls the resources. And that may be very detrimental to both mothers and children, because reducing birth spacing even further in this context may have very detrimental impacts. And we find no evidence, or very muted evidence, that households are changing the timing of fertility in response to the program. And the reasons for that are what is alluded to. That when you look at the decision-making within these households, there's a very stark division. So contraceptive use is almost non-existent in these villages. Women know about contraception, but very few of them, less than 1 or 2%, actually report using contraception. That's verified in the DHS data. So we're going to think about men as being essentially the prime decision maker over the timing of fertility. Men are also the primary decision maker over many different aspects of household decision making, but with regards to one exception. And that one exception is the control over resources that individuals bring into the household. And so, as is verified in the DHS and in our survey, that when individuals have earnings, they have exclusive right over how to spend those earnings. And so in our survey, when we ask about the cash transfer, who's actually deciding how to spend that cash transfer, both men and women almost uniformly agree that women have exclusive decision-making rights over how to spend that money. So then we're in this interesting context where we have sort of separate spheres agency, that men control the timing of fertility, but women control the use of the cash. The fact that women have control of the cash, obviously some of that cash then is used for outcomes that benefit men, such as food expenditures and so on and so forth. But the key element is that you combine that separate spheres agency with the fact that labor force participation rates of women here are very high, and women have productive investments they can engage in, and so they're choosing to make those investments. And it's that combination of factors that men don't choose how to spend the money, but women do have productive investment opportunities. It's that particular constellation of factors that cause men to have very little interest in changing the timing of fertility, because their private gains to the program are very limited.
Yeah.
And so what we do in the last part of that paper is to show across different countries, which countries have this type of separate spheres agency within the household, as well as women having labor market opportunities that they could spend the money on, to say which countries will look like this, which countries will look like a context in which men will be able to appropriate the transfers. So we set out cases where results will be very different, and other contexts in which our results have more external validity.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next, I think Abdul Rafi has a couple of questions. I'm going to unmute you. Please confine yourself to only one question, because we have a list of them coming ahead. Hi, can you ask your question? I've unmuted you from my end. If not, then I can ask your question here. So he's asking that in Bangladesh, returns to education is higher in urban areas than in rural areas, and that gaps in observed qualifications, including education and experience, are important determinants of gender wage gap. Is this relevant for most developing countries in your experience?
So our study is purely based on rural areas, where sometimes the returns to education are are difficult to estimate because of very low levels of labour force participation rates for women in these contexts. And so often the returns to education are through other outcomes beyond the labour market. So in our study, we don't have any variation in education levels that are provided, but we do see that the asset transfers that are provided to mothers does improve the educational outcomes, especially of boys, in terms of their education completion rates. So we could potentially use that to estimate, you know, what are the returns to education for boys, because essentially we have a first stage that's varying the amount of education that they obtain. We haven't done that as yet, but that would be kind of interesting to see. But we're, in a sense, we're already seeing what the mechanism for that is going to be, that by becoming more educated, they're choosing different occupations with higher returns. And so that's what's really allowing them to, these intergenerational gains to kick in.
Okay, I'm going to use my moderator privileges and limit the questions. I think we're already over time. If you're kind enough to stay on for 5 more minutes, I can perhaps ask 2 more questions. So let's go with Shahnaman Rana, and then followed by Dr. Amir Khan, and then we will conclude. So Shan, again, I'm going to unmute you if you would like to ask your question live, or let me know if I should do that for you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, Imran. Thanks a lot. This was inspirational as usual, especially the demand and supply side of services, which is super interesting for me. So I'm just, it's really not a question, it's more like a clarificatory thing. So the firm training and vocational training thing, what kind of firms are these? Because I would have thought that if I'm a mechanic at a small firm, and that experience should be as strong a signal as if I have a certificate from an NGO which says that I'm a mechanic. And so it seems like the results are dependent either on there's some asymmetric information and the firms are making sure the skills are not known to the labor market, or there's some non-substitutability of skills. So I was just curious.
So both elements are true. That we try to measure the skills that workers obtain through both routes. And there is some evidence, as theory would predict, that when you go through an apprenticeship, the skills that you're provided are slightly more firm specific than general skills. And so those will be valued to a lesser extent by other firms in the same sector. And motor mechanics is one of the 8 sectors we have in our data. But the first order thing is that you can't demonstrate that you have those skills, that you don't have a credible way to signal that you have those qualifications. And so when you fall into unemployment, it's not possible for you to demonstrate that labor market history. And that's what's causing those workers to take longer to get back onto the job ladder, despite them having very similar levels of skills. And so that certification process is vital. And that's especially, the returns to that are especially high in low-income labor markets where we don't have established labor market histories of individuals. If I lose my job at UCL, I still have my CV and I can credibly signal to an employer everything I've done up until this moment in life. But in other institutional contexts, we don't have a way for people to signify what they've done in the past. And it's that missing market for information that then drives the informational asymmetry, which makes the return to certification so high. And so that seems to be sort of a first order sort of market failure to try to correct, to enable people to have labor market histories that they can credibly signal to other employers. And that would then naturally narrow the gap between the returns to vocational and firm provided training. Then the difference will be driven purely by the types of skills that are acquired through these different forms of training.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Amir?
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yes, Imran. I'm from School of Business, and thank you very much. My question is slightly different because I've read at least 6 or 7 papers of yours, and I found them very useful. My question is that many of your papers are classic microeconomics. And then I read papal influences on fertility beliefs, and half of it was classic psychology on belief formation, conversion of belief to attitudes, which I found very useful. And then I read contagious animosity, which is classic sociology in groups and outgroups. which again I liked very much. So my question is that, is this some kind of trend which finally microeconomics has accepted and journals have accepted and are allowing publications, or is it specifically your and your collaborators attempt in you're playing and toying with this idea of, because everybody talks about multidisciplinary research, but I don't see it happen, and I'm really, really pleased and I really welcome it. So what's your general broad comment?
So Amir, I'd say this was what I was trying to describe on my very first slide. When we were thinking about how to measure human capital, I think more broadly, economists have now expanded our view beyond just what we would typically think of as educational qualifications or cognitive skills, that there's a long list of traits or characteristics of individuals that we now think of as being very important for economic outcomes. And some of those stem into personality traits, emotions, mental health, ability to negotiate, hot and cold decision making, and naturally that's going to draw in from realms of psychology and social psychology as well. So I think that's been a very steady long run trend for economists to think that for many of the outcomes that we're concerned with, we want to actually have a very broad view of human capital. And that naturally leads us to what might have been traditionally described as interdisciplinary work, but now I think of as being very mainstream within economics. And if we're trying to really get to a measure of individual welfare from these programs, perhaps we want to move away from just some of the hard outcomes that economists are used to in terms of earnings or in terms of underlying poverty, but to think about more psychological well-being. And my own personal motive for looking at that is both because I think that we should expand the set of outcomes that we look at, because it may not be such a positive story on all of these dimensions. You could imagine, people feeling more stress or, being under duress as they start to engage in the market economy. But I think, ultimately my interest comes in the fact that when we present results to policymakers, they want to know that voters care about this. So what makes people want these policies? So where does that demand for good policies come from? And the starting point for that is to say, well, when you have a set of beneficiaries on which all the standard economic outcomes suggest that they've gained permanently in large scale, do they themselves recognize that they've gained? And if so, would they be willing to advocate for this policy for other individuals? In addition, when non-eligible wealthier households in villages start seeing other households benefiting, moving out of poverty, do they want this program to expand, or do they then actually dislike the program even more because there's a narrowing of inequality and so on and so forth? So what's really happening to the social dynamics in these village economies as you have these programs is something that I think is of independent intrinsic intellectual interest, but ultimately feeds into the political economy of why these policies are not being adopted more broadly. And I think that's something that I'd really would like to understand in greater depth. If that means we have to draw on other disciplines, then so be it. But I think that's part of a much longer term trend within economics to broaden out the notions of what we think of as being relevant. And that's in part driven by the fact that economists are now much more comfortable with collecting our own data. And as a result, we've been able to close the gap between our models and what we're able to measure. But we're also writing down different models altogether. There's some very interesting work about, how much attention do we put onto different decisions, as well as understanding, how we can allocate our attention across decisions. And that's in the realm of psychology in a sense. But I think economists bring a particular set of tools to be able to discipline our work. And I think that's all very useful. And I think that's a very, very encouraging trend, and one that I hope will continue. And I would encourage any researcher, young or old, to get involved. The most interesting and exciting work is often on the boundaries of this.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we are really over time. Dr. Bakar, I'm aware you have a question. If you can keep it really brief and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Imran. These are really exciting talks. So I would be very brief. This question is regarding your urban Ugandan study. And I was just curious to see that how about some of the other related outcomes to unemployment? And particularly, I was interested in two One was, were there also differences in productivity of these two trainings on another two treatment arms, or there were differences in terms of separation rate? One reason why I'm interested in both of these, because they also determine unemployment directly or indirectly. Thank you.
Yeah, so in the paper we document it in much more detail. Job separation rates don't really differ between the two types of workers. The overall level of skills really don't differ between the two types of workers. What drives the earnings differential is not so much productivity on the job, but it's the fact that unemployment spells are so much shorter, that workers are much more likely to get onto the job ladder once they do. And they also make job-to-job transitions. And why do I move from one firm to another? Is because the new firm offers me a higher wage. And so that naturally creates this long-term divergence. But that's what creates the misallocation that's caused by the inability. On many dimensions, they actually are equally productive. And so, you know, the differences in outcomes are really driven by the fact that one can show it and not. In our more recent work that we're working on now, we're trying to understand how does this feed into the search strategies that are used by workers to begin with. And so what we find is that across the skills distribution, as workers have higher skills, they don't change their reservation wage, but they tend to search over slightly more formal firms, slightly larger firms, and they tend to search within the same sector in which they've been trained, whereas workers who've been unskilled tend to have much more diffuse and less intense search activity. So in a sense, skills actually lead to endogenously higher search effort and more targeted search effort. And that in turn drives some of the results that we find in our more recent work, which is really understanding the search and matching process that's going on. That skills don't just change the outcomes that I've been talking about in terms of duration of spells, but it also changes the nature of search to begin with.
All right, thank you everyone, and thank you, Dr. Imran, for taking out so much time for us today. There are many other questions, and I'm sorry to be disappointing people, but we really ran out of time. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us literally from all over the world today. And next week, just wanted to announce, we'll have Dr. Sonia Balhotra from the University of Essex. She'll be talking about layoffs, benefits, and intimate partner violence. We will be sending out links for registration soon, so please, for updates, watch our website and our social media handles. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and hope to see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.